Our second speaker in this session is Anders Crowfoot. Anders is the Vice President of the Federated Farmers in New Zealand. He's promised no jokes about rugby, and he's going to tell us about the experiences of New Zealand and what the realities are in terms of their situation in relation to trade. So please welcome Anders.
So I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to come over here and speak about free trade. Federated Farmers is probably the most equivalent to Australian NFF, although we do have quite a big policy team in our organization. We have about 26 policy analysts, so we do a fair bit of policy work as well. I'm not a trade expert, so this is very much from the farmer's perspective. And free trade is near and dear to New Zealand farmers' hearts because it very much has to be. So in terms of setting the scene and a bit of background, in many ways my speaking to you, a New York Yankee from the Wairarapa, underscores a dimension of our farm system and human capital that is underrated. That being how international it is. I would argue that primary industries are the most international aspect of New Zealand business. This picture here is where I come from. I emigrated from about an hour north of New York City 16 years ago to New Zealand with our family. And New York City was just sprawling out to engulf us. We were on my wife's family farm. Our kids were the 7th generation, but we really wanted to farm. And nobody made a living farming, just that's on the New York City fringe for about 3 generations. And so it was actually quite an interesting trade we did. We swapped 40 acres in New York State for 7,000 acres in New Zealand and got this sort of scenery to boot. New Zealand's isolation means that we have to trade. It's been ingrained since the first waves of organized European migrations in the 19th century. At first, the majority of New Zealand farms were focused on producing wool and meat from sheep and milk from cattle, but exports were quite limited, just non-refrigerated or salted items. Technology came to our rescue in the form of refrigeration towards the end of the 19th century. Had a disruptive influence in terms of the farming systems and shifted our focus from a domestic to an export one. But this was still within the British imperial family. Refrigeration saw meat and dairy products being exported, the first shipment leaving New Zealand on the 18th of February, 1882 from Dunedin. The creation of these new markets changed farming by attracting skilled migrants to New Zealand, which lies in a pastoral sweet spot. We've got good water, sunshine hours, temperature, and soils. It's a fantastic place for pastoral agriculture. Influxes of capital enabled mechanization and technology to be imported, while inventiveness and the number 8 wire mentality started to create new technology. And I really love the inventiveness in New Zealand, and one of the reasons I moved my family halfway around the world was actually be part of that. You used to hear a lot about Yankee ingenuity. You don't hear that very much anymore. You still do hear about Kiwi ingenuity, so it's a great place to raise kids. When Britain joined the EU, it had a very dramatic impact. Farming had been pretty good up till then, but all of a sudden the market started to dry up. Farming became less prosperous due to that just narrow primary production into one market. In the 70s, on-farm costs rose with the oil shocks, returns fell, but land prices remained high and still remain high. That's some pictures of early on in the trading and the refrigeration. In 1984, they started reforming the New Zealand economy. This resulted in the cornucopia of subsidies and tariffs. It resulted in the introduction of a huge number of subsidies and tariffs in an attempt to hold back the rest of the world. This crumpled in 1984 with the defeat of Robert Muldoon's national government and the election of a radically reforming Labour government of David Lange and Roger Douglas. Suddenly, the subsidies and trade protection were removed, and New Zealand trade was gradually liberalized. Remarkably, it was cheered on and championed by federated farmers, who foresaw the cancerous effects of subsidies and protection. Since 1986, productivity in New Zealand agricultural sector has improved at an average of 5.9% per year. Until then, nearly 40% of the average New Zealand sheep and beef farmers' gross income came from government subsidies. Farmers were paid to rip out native vegetation, which is quite ironic given today's environmental climate. They were encouraged to produce without regards to market. But unfortunately, you don't really get rich just selling to yourselves, and very hard to generate export income just selling amongst yourselves. By 1985, trade with the UK had dramatically increased. However, Muldoon's parting gift of a free trade agreement with Australia in 1983, the CER, had started to blossom. And that was a way of actually starting to trade to increase our markets elsewhere. There were a number of effects of the reforms on outlook and trade, and you may think that this major policy change, removing farm subsidies, would have destroyed the makeup of our farming systems. On the contrary, our farmers came through that experience stronger than ever. For farming, there is life after subsidies. And while the late David Lange predicted that farming was a sunset industry in the 1980s and that manufacturing and tourism would take their place, a compatriot of mine, Mark Twain, would answer in reply to the rumors of agriculture's death have been greatly exaggerated. A lack of subsidies and tariff barriers forced New Zealand producers to grow up and talk to the markets they were selling into. The removal of farm subsidies in New Zealand has given birth to a vibrant, diversified, and growing rural economy. Early predictions were that 8,000 farms would fail. In the end, only 800 did. As of 2013, 73% of New Zealand's merchandise exports were from the primary sector. That's 5% higher than in 2008. Of the 2013, about 45% is from the traditional pastoral side of meat, wool, dairy, seeds, and crops. The removal of subsidies has proven to be the catalyst for productivity gains. In the 20 years since 1986-87, the value of economic activity in New Zealand's farm sector has grown by 40% in constant dollar terms and continues to do so. Such improvement in productivity are readily apparent at the level of the individual family farm. Lambing percentages, lamb export slaughter weight, and milk fat processed per cow have massively increased. The diversification of land use prompted by the removal of subsidies has been beneficial for farmers and has increased the size and scope of New Zealand agricultural sector as new innovative products have been developed. Farmers are now farming better than ever, contributing 14 billion or 6% of our country's GDP from behind the farm gate. They are much more conscious that their activities must make good business sense. No longer are they chasing subsidies, pursuing maximum production at any cost. Farmers maintain cost structures that reflect the real earning capacity of their farms. There's a farm consultant in Christchurch named Peter Alexander, who one of his famous quotes is basically, farming for production is a vanity and farming for profit is sanity. He's got a lot of very good quotes. Farmers are investing in protecting the environment, and the value of the land is based on its earning capacity in the market. Good management of the environment is an integral part of sustainable agricultural practice by farmers, where farmers are producing more from less. With the removal of subsidies, agricultural practice is now driven by demands of the market and by the consumers. And one of the interesting downstream effects of that is there's now a lot of talk in New Zealand about the consumer as the regulator rather than the government being the regulator. The removal of subsidies has also broadened the base of farming and encompassed diversified activities such as rural tourism and blended forms of agriculture, where dairy farms in the Bay of Plenty and Nelson also grow horticultural products. New Zealand now boasts of the lowest level of agricultural support for the industrialized countries in the OECD. The level of assistance to agriculture in New Zealand now represents only 1% of farming income. In 2013, the worst drought in 70 years, covering the South Island's west coast, which gets about 3 meters of rain normally, and the entire North Island saw only 146 rural assistance payments granted. Given these are means and asset tested, it underscores just how little support farming receives in contrast to the EU, where farmers are getting payments due to Russian sanctions. What support New Zealand farmers do receive is mainly in the form of government funding of agricultural research, so it's quite indirect. Agricultural productivity is consistently the leading sector of labor productivity. A key difference between New Zealand and other countries is that New Zealand exports the vast majority of its agricultural production. Upwards of 95% of what we produce is exported. We produce enough food to feed at least 24 million people, although some estimates are higher. This makes New Zealand a significant player in the world trade of foodstuffs, being the largest dairy exporter and the largest exporter of lamb, while by no means being the largest producers. We are also the largest global exporter of a number of herbage seeds. This also goes to highlight the knife edge the world sits on between food surplus and food deficit and food security. Thanks to the structural realignment domestically, New Zealand farming turned from a myopic dependence upon Mother Britain to having to hustle for markets and opportunity. Before I address that opportunity, I wish to highlight something Federated Farmers President Dr. William Ralston recently wrote about. We have become accustomed to looking at trade barriers and threats symmetrically, things like quotas, subsidies, and tariffs, by local campaigns, or British farmers objecting to Tesco's promoting New Zealand lamb. Earlier this year, The Economist magazine noted the United States Farm Bill was a strange piece of legislation which cost nearly $1 trillion US. It mixes benefits that mostly go to the poor, food stamps, with agricultural subsidies that mostly go to the rich, crop subsidies for large farms. Given a blank slate, nobody with an interest in either alleviating poverty or improving farming would construct such a law. Yet, here it came again. As an American New Zealander, I must concur with the Economist's conclusion. One of my first exposures many years ago to it was going to a farm where it was actually economic for them to grow a corn crop, build storage for it, harvest it, put it in storage, collect the subsidy, and they had actually just covered their costs. So it was profitable from it. They hadn't even sold the crop yet. Just absurd. There's also an asymmetrical trade that's highlighted recently by the Fonterra Cooperative Group Chief Executive Theo Spearings. On TV3's The Nation, he put the impact of the Ebola virus to New Zealand at $150 million, yet no one in New Zealand is infected. What's been affected? About 6% of Fonterra's sales. Animal disease provides another threat. A new assessment of foot and mouth disease puts the estimated cost of large-scale outbreak at $16 billion over 6 years to New Zealand. This would also tip us into a recession. Markets live on fear and rumor, and last year's non-botulism scare gives a hint as to what effect a major animal disease outbreak could result in. Ebola and potentially foot and mouth disease are joined by another example of asymmetrical trade threats, the eastern Ukraine. Even what Russian separatists do in the Ukraine materially impacts the price of our dairy exports and our wealth as a country. So the knock-on effect that Ebola has upon the economies we trade with, and dislocation of up to 3 billion liters of milk caused by Russian sanctions. These are largely unforeseen and unpredictable. Asymmetrical trade threats are costing us hundreds of millions of dollars. The now discredited food miles concept could have fallen into this category, as could future consumer movements. I put this out there because we need to be attuned to the trees falling in the forest. No matter how removed, technology, disease, and political events seemingly unrelated can have quite an impact on us. So we trade today, and we're going to be trading tomorrow. And there's good news in that. The Helen Clark-led government and the John Key-led national government have built on a platform laid down since 1984. You cannot secure free trade if you do not live the dream, and Exhibit A is China. Our exports to China have jumped 160% since the free trade came into force in 2008. In 2004 to 2006, we exported some $2 billion worth of goods to China. In the year September 2014, that stood at $11.35 billion, and that was 37% up on the same point in 2013. So it's just climbing dramatically. Last December, we signed a free trade agreement with Taiwan that has seen trade break the billion-dollar barrier, and that being 19.5% upon the same point in 2013. It's now our, thank you, it's now our 7th largest trading partner. Even Britain remains our 6th largest, with exports up over 10% in the year to September. Free trade has enabled and not hindered New Zealand. We are richer and better off for it. Our trading partners rely heavily on the Asia Pacific, which underscores why we need the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It must be a partnership that we can embrace, however. When it comes to the TPP, Dr. Ralston recently wrote, "I find it remarkable you can largely tell a person's position by the acronyms they use. As we call it the TPP, we fall into the supporter category, but those who add an A, making it the TPPA, generally fall into the opposing camp. Supporters use partnership, opponents prefer agreement. Whatever your view, no one under the age of 40 will realistically recall what New Zealand was like when we had a tariff for every occasion. A comprehensive TPP must aim to put on a path to extinction. If TPP members play favorites with certain countries over others, we could easily end up being worse off than we were before the TPP. A TPP that doesn't address trade barriers at and behind the border is no agreement at all. If some countries cannot stand the trade heat, they need to get out of the negotiation kitchen, allowing others who can cook up an agreement, which New Zealand has deserved since 1984. A friend, John Ackland, who was chairman of the Meat Board for a number of years, once explained to us, well before we'd moved to New Zealand, that in New Zealand's trade negotiations, it was like going to a game of strip poker, where New Zealand showed up completely in the nick, whereas everybody else showed up fully dressed and with their bare coats on. The problem with sort of living the dream is that you're really running on a high wire without anything underneath you. There's been no reason why countries in the slow lane cannot join later when the scale and ambition of the TPP is known. The Three Musketeers motto, all for one and one for all, defines whether the TPP will stand as a beacon or fall into the trade abyss, like Doha sadly seems to have done. If we compromise just to get the agreement over the line, agriculture will be trapped permanently in the too hard basket. While there's much conjecture about TPP benefits, Tim Grosser, our trade minister, has correctly noted that the China Free Trade Agreement underestimated economic benefits by between 10 and 17 times. The recent agreement with Taiwan has seen bilateral trade surge 19.5% in the year to September, bearing in mind it was signed only last December. It seems we do very well if agriculture and agri-food is enabled and is not hindered by such agreements. This is why the TPP must address trade barriers behind the border. If everyone plays ball, and the members of the TPP will account for 1/4 of global trade. This is a huge prize, and winning a 2-year seat on the United Nations Security Council has to give us some diplomatic clout. Thank you.